When I first heard about the Iceman, I have to admit I was intrigued. People painted him as this cold, calculating professional, someone who could slip in, do the job, and vanish without leaving a trace. He had the reputation of a ghost in the shadows, a man who could take care of business like no one else. And I'll be honest, in our world, that kind of reputation carries weight. It gets people talking, makes your name stick. But the thing is, in this life, the image people project and the reality of who they are can be two completely different things. And that's exactly what caught my attention about the Iceman. Something felt off from the start. See, when you spend your life in situations where life and death decisions are the daily bread, you start to notice the little things. The way someone talks about what they've done, the way they carry themselves, the kind of respect or fear they command. The Iceman had all the stories. Big stories, flashy stories. He wanted everyone to believe he was untouchable, precise, the kind of guy you'd never see coming. But if you know the business like I do, you know it's never about the stories. It's about the work, the quiet work, the methodical, unseen moves that leave no trace behind. And let me tell you, the more I listened, the more the shine started to fade. People tend to get caught up in names and headlines and the theatrics, and I get it. He made it easy for people to be impressed. He had this aura, this way of telling tales that made it sound like he was larger than life. But here's the thing, real professionals don't need to make noise. They don't brag. They don't need to sit around telling you how good they are. If you're that good, your work speaks for itself. And if it doesn't, well, that's usually because you're not who you claim to be. I started noticing patterns in the way he spoke. Little things that might seem insignificant to the outside world, but scream fraud to someone who's been in the trenches. The timing of his stories, a lack of detail when it counted, the way he'd embellish names or events. It was all smoke and mirrors, designed to make him look untouchable, to make people believe in a myth that wasn't real. And that's dangerous in a way. It gets people thinking you're someone you're not. And in this line of work, that can be deadly. The more I watched, the more I realized that the Iceman's reputation was built on everything except authenticity. Everything he wanted the world to see was carefully constructed, polished to perfection, but underneath, it didn't hold up. And that's the first lesson I want people to understand. Not everyone who tells you they're a professional, not everyone who claims to be untouchable actually is. You learn to trust actions, not words, and to see beyond the flashy stories. In the end, it was clear what people thought they knew about the Iceman and what was real were two entirely different worlds. And once you see that, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. If you want, I can expand the next key point the same way, so the speech feels fully connected and flows seamlessly from one point to the next. Do you want me to do that next? Now, the thing about spotting a fraud is that it's all in the details. The little things most people don't see. When you've been in this business as long as I have, you start to develop a kind of instinct. You can tell when someone's bluffing, when they're all flash and no substance. And with the Iceman, that instinct kicked in almost immediately. On the surface, he looked like the real deal. Cool, collected, confident. But there were red flags that only someone who's been in the trenches would notice. For starters, his stories never lined up the way they should. He'd tell you about taking out targets, about planning hits, but the details were always just slightly off. He didn't talk about timing, about patience, about the kind of preparation a real professional needs to make sure nothing goes wrong. He skipped over the parts that matter most, the parts that keep you alive and keep the job clean, and any real hitman knows it's those parts, the invisible work, that define whether you're legit or just pretending. Another thing that stood out was how he handled pressure in conversation. A real professional has a calm confidence that doesn't need to be proved. When I asked questions about his methods, about situations that should have tested his skills, he stumbled. Not just a little stumble, but a hesitation, a fumble that a true professional would never show. That's when the cracks start to appear. It's subtle, but when you know what to look for, it's impossible to ignore. And it wasn't just the stories or the demeanor, it was the respect or lack of it from the people around him. In our world, respect isn't demanded, it's earned. People notice when someone isn't what they claim to be, even if they don't say it outright. The way others reacted around him, the little sideways glances, the quiet doubts, they all added up. A fraud can fake bravado for a while, but they can't fake the instincts of everyone else in the room who knows. the ropes. Then there was the overcompensation. The Iceman had a tendency to over-explain, to make sure everyone understood just how dangerous he was. That's another huge red flag. Real pros don't need to sell themselves. They operate quietly, efficiently, and their work does the talking. When someone goes out of their way to prove their own legend, it usually means there isn't much substance behind it. The more I paid attention, the more I realized that his entire persona was carefully constructed, designed to impress people who didn't know any better. It was a performance, and performances can be convincing at first, but to someone who's been in the real business, it's transparent. The mistakes, the exaggerations, the empty confidence, they all stick out like neon signs. So when I say I knew the Iceman was a fraud, I don't just mean it felt wrong. I knew it because the little things that reveal a true professional just weren't there. And once you notice those things, there's no going back. You can't unsee the difference between someone who talks the talk and someone who actually walks the walk. I can now do key point 3 in the same style, keeping this smooth, story-driven flow if you want to continue building the speech. You know, one of the biggest things that gave him away was what I like to call the style versus substance trap. The Iceman had all the style in the world. Everything about him looked polished, impressive, like he stepped out of a movie. The way he told his stories, the little details he highlighted, the way he carried himself, it all screamed confidence. And on the surface, it was easy to be fooled. People hear those kinds of stories and see that kind of confidence, and they assume it equals real skill. But in our world, confidence without competence is a danger, not a mark of respect. Here's the thing about real professionals: the work is quiet. It's deliberate. It's invisible. You don't make a show of it. You don't go around telling everyone what you've done, because the people who need to know already know. And if you've done your job right, there's no applause, no recognition, no need for headlines. That's what separates someone who's legit from someone who's pretending. You can have all the theatrics in the world, but if you haven't actually earned it in the streets, it doesn't hold up. The Iceman, he was all theatrics. He had a way of making even the simplest story sound like a high-stakes thriller. And at first it's captivating. You want to believe it, you want to be impressed. But when you listen closely, when you think like someone who's actually done this work, it doesn't add up. The operations he described didn't follow the logic, the planning, or the discipline that real professionals use to keep themselves safe and get the job done. It was all surface level, designed to impress outsiders, not anyone who actually understands the work. Another thing I noticed was his reliance on names, notoriety, and drama. He would throw around associations, claim connections, drop the names of people he said he'd worked with, all to make himself look untouchable. But real professionals don't need to do that. Their credibility comes from their reputation earned in silence, not the names they drop or the stories they embellish. The more you have to tell people how dangerous you are, the less dangerous you actually are. It's that simple. And it wasn't just about impressing others. It was about creating an illusion. The Iceman wanted everyone to see him as someone they could never touch, someone who operated on another level. But in reality, he was performing a role. He was playing a part he hadn't actually earned. And that's something anyone who's been in this life can see immediately, even if the audience doesn't. It's the difference between someone who acts dangerous and someone who is dangerous. The lines are subtle to outsiders, but clear as day to those who've lived it. By the time I started putting it all together, the conclusion was obvious. All the style in the world can't hide the lack of substance. And when it comes down to it, substance is what matters. Style is a distraction, a way to cover up weakness. And that's exactly what the Iceman relied on. Everything that looked impressive, nothing that proved he was the real deal. I can now move on to key point 4 and expand it the same way, keeping the smooth flow in Tony-style storytelling if you want. Another thing that really exposed him was the technical mistakes and misunderstandings he kept making. Now, I don't mean small slip-ups like forgetting a name or a date. Everybody does that. But real professionals don't mess up the fundamentals of the work. And the Iceman, he made mistakes that anyone who's been in the business would spot instantly. He didn't understand the way certain operations are planned, the way weapons are handled, or the kind of precautions a real professional takes to avoid leaving a trace. Those aren't things you learn from a movie or a book. They're learned from experience, from being in the field, from living it day in and day out. I remember one story told about a hit he supposedly carried out. On paper, it sounded neat, it sounded calculated, but when you looked at the logistics, it didn't make any sense. The timing, he claimed, the way he described moving, even the choices he made, it was amateur stuff. Anyone with real experience would have seen it fall apart instantly. And that's the kind of mistake that's impossible to fake. You can't bluff your way past the basics if you've never actually been there. Another red flag was his understanding of weapons. He'd throw around terms like he knew what he was talking about, but the way he described handling them was all wrong. A professional hitman doesn't just know how to fire a gun. They understand the mechanics, the timing, the precision needed for every single move. One small error in technique can ruin the whole operation, and he just didn't grasp that. It's the difference between someone who's read a lot of crime novels and someone who's actually been in the streets doing the war. It wasn't just about weapons or logistics, it was about procedure. A real professional follows a system, a method that's honed over years of experience, and it shows in everything they do, from planning to execution. The Iceman didn't follow any system. He talked a lot about improvisation and clever tricks, but the reality was real improvisation only works when you have a foundation of skill to rely on. Without that, it's just a mess waiting to happen. And that's exactly what his story sounded like, a mess dressed up to look impressive. Even the small details that most people wouldn't notice were off. The way he described surveillance, the way he talked about getting in and out of a place, it wasn't consistent with reality. Professionals notice these little things because they know how everything needs to line up perfectly to stay safe and succeed. Those inconsistencies were like flashing neon signs to anyone who understood the work. By the time you put all of it together, the wrong timing, the improper handling, the lack of planning, it became crystal clear that he was pretending. All the dramatics, all the reputation in the world couldn't cover up the fact that he didn't actually know how to do what he claimed. And that's when it hit me. You can talk all you want, you can act like a professional. But if you can't handle the technical side of the job, it doesn't matter. I can expand key point 5 next in the same style, keeping it seamless and story-driven. Do you want me to do that? Now, one of the most telling signs that someone's a fraud isn't in the technical details or the timing. It's in the psychology. The Iceman had a lot of bravado, a lot of confidence, but the way he carried it wasn't the way a real professional carries themselves. There's a difference between quiet confidence and the kind of arrogance that's meant to impress. And believe me, someone who's actually been in the business knows it immediately. The real pros don't need to tell you how dangerous they are. They let their actions do the talking. The Iceman, on the other hand, couldn't stop himself from embellishing, from overplaying every story to make sure people understood just how lethal he was. He'd describe things with extra drama, make the target sound impossible, and emphasize the danger like it was part of his performance. That's a classic sign. Someone who's done it for real doesn't need to turn it into a story. They know the work speaks for itself, and they know people who matter will notice without any fanfare. And there's another psychological tell, overcompensation. He was always trying to prove something, to show that he was untouchable or smarter than everyone else. But in this line of work, if you have to prove yourself constantly, it usually means you're hiding something. Confidence isn't loud, it's steady. It doesn't need to be validated by others because it's rooted in real experience. He was constantly fishing for validation. And that's exactly the kind of thing someone who's faking it does. The exaggerations didn't stop at storytelling. They seeped into his attitude too. He wanted people to fear him, to admire him, to believe he was operating on another level. But real professionals earn fear, not demand it. The way he interacted with others, the way he positioned himself as someone untouchable, it all screamed manufactured persona. And to anyone who spent time in this life, it's impossible to ignore. You see through the act almost immediately. There's also the impatience in his behavior. Real professionals understand timing and restraint. They know when to speak, when to act, and when to let things unfold quietly. The Iceman didn't have that. He had to impress, had to make an impact, had to control the narrative. That impatience another signal that he wasn't authentic. When someone's lived it, they know the world doesn't need a constant performance to prove their worth. It's in the results, not the storytelling. By the time I put all these pieces together, the overdramatization, the arrogance, the need for validation, the impatience, it painted a clear picture. Psychology is as much a part of this world as technique or timing. You can't fake the mindset of someone who's actually walked the path. The way a person thinks, the way they react under scrutiny, the way they measure themselves against real experience, it all shows. And in the case of the Iceman, his psychology revealed him long before any of his so-called accomplishments could. In the end, it's simple. Real professionals don't need to convince you they're real. Their presence, their restraint, their quiet confidence does it for them. And that's exactly why the Iceman's act didn't hold up. I can now expand key point 6 in the same seamless, story-driven style to wrap the speech with strong, impactful conclusions. When it all comes down to it, the biggest lesson I learned from watching the Iceman was about seeing through the illusion. People love to believe in legends, in stories that sound bigger than life, and he certainly made it easy for them. But there's a difference between a legend and the truth. And if you've spent any time in the real world of this business, you learn how to spot that difference quickly. It's all about paying attention, questioning what people tell you, and not letting appearances blind you. The first thing you learn is that actions always outweigh words. Anyone can talk a big game. Anyone can spin a story to make themselves look untouchable. But the truth is in what they actually do. Do they follow through? Do they handle things the way a professional would? Do they earn the respect of those who truly understand the work? The Iceman had all the words, all the bravado, but when you look at the substance or the lack of it, it tells a completely different story. And that's the lesson that applies beyond just this one case. It's about learning to see past the noise and look for what's real. Another key thing is trust your instincts. When something doesn't feel right, it usually isn't. I had a gut feeling about him from the start, and everything I observed only confirmed it. Instinct isn't just a hunch, it's experience talking. When you've been in situations where lives are on the line, you start to notice patterns, to read the subtleties that others overlook. The Iceman had a way of seeming convincing to people who weren't paying close attention, but to someone who knew what to look for. The signs were all there, the inconsistencies, the exaggerations, the need to overcompensate. Those little things are never wrong. You also learn that credibility can't be faked. Reputation isn't built on stories, it's built on proof, on actions that survive scrutiny. The Iceman tried to manufacture his reputation through storytelling and theatrics, but a reputation like that is paper thin if it's not backed by real experience. Anyone who's lived it sees through the performance almost immediately. That's why it's so important to distinguish between the myth someone wants you to believe and the reality of what they've actually done. Finally, there's the broader lesson about deception in general. Fraudsters rely on the fact that most people don't know what to look for. They count on assumptions, on awe, on superficial impressions. But if you take the time to look closely, to compare words with actions, to see who really knows what they're talking about, the truth becomes obvious. And once you know how to see that, it's hard to be fooled again. So when I reflect on all of this, it isn't juice about exposing a fraud. It's about learning to trust your judgment, to pay attention to the details, and to never let a flashy story replace the evidence of real skill. It's about understanding that real professionals don't need to tell you how good they are. And that's the truth the Iceman could never hide. If you want, I can now combine all 6 expanded points into a single seamless speech that flows naturally from start to finish, keeping the Tony-style tone and dramatic impact. This would give you a full speech ready to deliver.